So welcome. I think that's about it. Not sure what else to say.
Okay. Hey, must see there, John B. Zoe. Thanks for the quick opening remarks. Good day, everybody. Welcome to our Hotiits'eeda webinar on Indigenous data sovereignty. My name is Ktunaxa Ko, and I'll be the moderator, facilitator here for this virtual space for this recorded webinar. I am situated in Yellowknife in Denendeh, traditional lands of the Yellowknives Dene, and just take some time to acknowledge that we're operating on those lands, and we're happy that for that connection here to live and to learn on the territory of the Yellowknives Dene. So welcome one and all. Hotiits'eeda is a research support unit hosted by the Ktunaxa government and governed primarily by Indigenous governments within the Northwest Territories. Hotiits'eeda connects NWT organizations and communities with researchers and funding to achieve health research and training goals. It is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Today is a Hotiits'eeda sponsored recorded webinar on Indigenous data sovereignty. This event is a virtual space for knowledge transfer for partners, community members, and researchers to learn and connect about Indigenous data sovereignty. We heard just a little bit there from John B. Zoe. Must see for open us up this webinar here, John. During this presentation, we're going to ask that people that are participating maybe to mute your video, and if you're from a place with connectivity issues, maybe your video and your audio as well too. Once our presentations are completed, we're going to have some time for a question period. At any time, if you're a participant or audience member, you can type your questions into the chat, and we won't get to those questions until the end of the presentations, but please feel free to enter any comments or questions into the chat. We're going to be spending about 90 minutes here listening to some presentations, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity at the end to connect with some questions. So with that, we'll get right into it. I'd like now to take some time to acknowledge and recognize Gwen Phillips, a citizen of the Ktunaxa Nation and champion for the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. Gwen is going to be our first presenter today with her presentation, Community-Driven Nation-Based Planning and Data Governance. With that, Gwen, the floor is virtually yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me in today. So I am Ktunaxa, southeast corner of the province of BC, northern Montana, and northern Idaho. So thank you for inviting me to speak with you. It's been a privilege. Yesterday I had a chat to explore what today might be like, and I think this is going to be a good day, a privilege to be able to share it with you. The Ktunaxa ourselves as a nation, and then in British Columbia a little bit more broadly, we've been exploring self-government for decades, and we've participated, the Ktunaxa, in the BC treaty process for about 20 years or more. We've not negotiated a final treaty, but we've been using that process to fund our rebuilding. We're currently in pause mode because many things have changed over the time since the beginning of those negotiations. And we're now assessing our governance interests within the context that currently exists. We are now in the era of DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Ktunaxa peoples' collective vision has been guiding our rebuilding work since the year 2000. And this work has included advancing our interests in data. Data is a critical asset of any government. I have become known in BC as the First Nations data champion, and I'm also known as the grandmother that helped the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner formulate their grandmother perspective in relation to disaggregated data, noting that the government should collect data only in processes where they're looking to care for us. So basically underscoring that if we're collecting data, we need to know because we care. I also volunteer as a director on the First Nations Information Governance Center Board for BC Region, and that's advancing BC First Nations governance collective vision around data. And that's really to ensure that we each achieve data sovereignty in alignment with our own worldview. That's the vision that the FNIG board table holds now. I was a member of the BC First Nations Health Council from the very beginning of time when that process started, and I was sat there for over 10 years, just left there last December because I've got a couple of very big items in front of me to deal with, and that institution is well set now. And I was one of the members of the negotiating team when we did that transfer. And one of the things we did to enable the transfer was negotiated a tripartite data quality sharing agreement. I also have the privilege of working with nations across the country as the Indigenous co-chair of the Indigenous Community Development National Strategy Working Group, along with the governance unit of ISC headquarters. And they themselves have visited the Northwest Territories with me, that headquarters unit. So I dragged someone from the governance unit along with me on a journey across Canada, introducing them to communities all across Canada. And so we got to drive this lady across your ice bridge, and boy, she was scared. That lady, I never heard a bureaucrat be quiet and humbled before like that. So I thank you very much for that experience. Go ahead and click on the slides, please. I'm trying to see where I am there. I've got myself there. Yeah, so go ahead and click to the next slide. So you will likely have heard the concept of OCAP historically, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute or two. But data sovereignty is quite a new concept to a lot of people. And in fact, I just the other day had somebody say, you know, I never really heard or really understood what data sovereignty was until probably a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And I said, yeah, a lot of people don't really think about data as a critical asset, as something that you actually want to maintain your ownership of and not let anybody else be the owner of. And so, in a way, as being a sovereign or semi-sovereign, we're basically, you know, the owners of our own destiny. We have enough authority to do what we want for ourselves. And so data sovereignty is really about exercising self-determination. It's about taking control of your population data. So that's data that relates to you in a disaggregated form as you as a distinct Indigenous society. So there's a broader aggregation of Indigenous people, then they zero in on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, the constitutional conversation. But really inside of that, there are very unique populations. And so taking control of your population data is really about data sovereignty is. It is also giving notice to the other governments, to researchers, and basically to the world, that you own your data and you will not permit others to collect your data, use your data, or access data that is already stored somewhere without your prior knowledge and informed consent. So it takes the concept of an individual in a research frame giving free, prior, and informed consent and bumps it up to the collective identity we share as Indigenous populations, not in the grand scale, but on the scale of unique nation groups. And it brings that sovereignty, that ownership of data to us. So data governance, on the other hand, is really about how you practice data sovereignty. And so asserting data sovereignty doesn't really cost you anything. It's just making a statement or two. But then when it comes to taking data sovereignty to the level of actually making it happen, you're assuming a responsibility there. So data governance is practicing data sovereignty. And that's through law, policy, protocol, procedure, assuming authority for your population data. Again, that's the data that relates to you as a distinct society. The documents and records and information management, on the other hand, and if we think about data records and information management as well in that context, it includes things like implementing policies, systems, procedures to capture, create, access, distribute, use, store, blah, 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 an organization's records and informations. So you have data, records and information that relates to your organization and how you do your business, your minutes, all of your things that you do. But then you also have data that relates to your population, and they're distinctly different things, and you have to treat them a little bit differently, but you've got to basically get a handle on the whole big picture. Data has been used to describe us, Indigenous peoples, as people with problems. And in fact, it became a 4-letter word for us for a long time. It's still a 4-letter word, but now it's getting a little bit different meaning. Myself, I'm not a data geek. You got to know that. I'm a governance geek and a Ktunaxa governance geek in that. And so I'm just learning really about the science of data, but I know about data because our nations were data collectors forever. So data has been used to describe us as people with problems. And in fact, we're resilient and we're strong. Our people are traumatized and our systems have been badly eroded after generations of being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. And only just now, we're becoming, that truth is becoming acknowledged by Canadians. We are in healing mode and we're in rebuilding mode, and that has to be acknowledged. And we need the time and space to do this work. Through community-led planning and then the reporting that goes along with that, we can empower our own people to start establishing, our visions of the future, telling our own stories and using data to back up those stories. The big Canadian census, they go out and collect a whole lot of data and then try to figure out what stories they can tell with it. Well, my nation, we want to tell our story. We want to say what our journey is towards the picture of our future. And we need the data to back that up, to validate that that change is happening. So it's a little bit of a reverse in process here, where our data will be actually attached to our story from the beginning. We'll define what the data is we need to tell our story and then set out to collect it. So through this community-led planning, really we see that we will be implementing a data strategy going right along with it. Click, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you probably heard of the concept of OCAP before, if you're in research or the environment of research. And those are a set of principles that have been hanging around for probably close to 30 years now. And those principles stand for ownership, control, access, and possession of data. And it started off with NAHO, the National Aboriginal Health Organization, all those years ago, and ended up being trademarked by the First Nations Information Governance Center. It's a national corporate entity that does the Regional Health Survey and all those other surveys. They trademarked it. Just to note, I voted against trademarking that in the under Canadian intellectual property law. I believed we should be creating a common insignia that is something representing Indigenous ownership, so that it wasn't bringing our intellectual property into their IP environment, because they don't necessarily view IP the same way we do. Oh, well, it's been trademarked, so at least there's nobody else can use those set of principles except us as First Nations people or Indigenous people, I guess more broadly as we're called now. Ownership and control are really aspects of governance, asserting ownership and taking control by setting standards. And then if you think about the access and possession, it's really about management of the data. And so you will permit access to others, potentially. You'll allow others to possess your data. You will possess data as well, of course, but it's really thinking about it in terms of governance and management. And both, of course, are important aspects for us to put standards around. Governance is about setting standards. So your governance standards must align with your own values as the peoples you are. Ktunaxa data-related policies and procedures help other groups to understand how they should treat our data. They help explain our worldview. We must define what quality data is and move away from measuring sickness and disease, moving towards measuring our own visions of well-being. You can quantify things that are important to you. It just takes time to actually figure out what those things are that are important to you and put some value to them that is measurable value. You can measure sickness and dysfunction. It's easy. It's more difficult to measure vibrancy. It's more difficult to measure the strength, but that's okay. We're not afraid of a little hard work. We're tired of measuring sickness and dysfunction. It's not appropriate any longer to be measuring our well-being in terms of sickness and disease. We want to measure how well our language is. We want to measure how well our lands and air and water are. We want to measure how well our people are doing inside of those environments. We want to measure how well our relationships are faring. So there's a lot of things that we want to measure in terms of our own standards that are no business of the other governments, and they probably don't even understand some of it, and that's okay. Click, please. We're in, as I said, this DREP era, this environment now that is like no other in the 40 so years that I've been involved with my nation's business. My great-grandfather, the opening slide was my great-grandparents. He was the last war chief for my nation. And when he basically was alive, he was in Ottawa saying, we're a nation of people that need to be recognized. King George said he was going to recognize us, but basically what's going on here? And that was over 100 years ago. And so here I am, possessing part of his name going forward, demanding the same things in Ottawa. But now, with Ottawa actually recognizing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that the whole landscape has changed. But we don't really understand how it's changed yet. So if you think about intellectual property, in the Canadian landscape, it's business law. It's about trademark, copyright. That's my song, that's my story, that's my thought, that's my original idea, that's my mechanical device, etc. And so nobody else can take advantage of your property. Then when you die, there's a number of years before your property is up for fair game, generally speaking. There are some provisions that can be attached to that, but generally. In our world, intellectual property is us. It is our ownership of our distinct identity, our language, our songs, our manifestations of our sciences, our medicines, our designs. That's our intellectual property, including our data. And so for us, when they think about intellectual property, it's different than our worldview. And the DRIP environment is now acknowledging that we own those things. So it's basically acknowledging that we are owners of our data, that we are sovereign in the data environment. If we think about the law that's in front of us now, the Child Welfare Law federally, the Language Act federally, it didn't recognize our intellectual property ownership, our ownership of our language, etc. And the concepts of things like, or the concepts that are being batted around, like the best interests of the child, that's for nobody but us to define. Because again, elements of that include language and culture and identity, those concepts of well-being. Again, that's your nation to define, my nation to define, no generic Indian anymore. And in fact, because every Indigenous person has a right to a nationality, they've got to stop lumping us together. They like to lump us together. Oh, the First Nations in one big lump, instead of recognizing the 70-some unique nations we are, close to 80 unique nations we are across Canada. And then the governing bodies that attach to those nations, 600 and some governing bodies attached to those nation identities, those linguistic nation identities. It's important to note, a nation is not an entity, it's identity. I am Ktunaxa, I speak the Ktunaxa language, but I'm Akanahonik. I am the people from the place where the water comes out of the rock. And so we have our own identities to reclaim. And those other governments better wrap their heads around that and stop using these generic terms and colonial linguistic terms to describe us. We take our own identity back here. So we must be the ones, basically, that are deciding who we are, that are standing our people up, standing ourselves up, and putting meaning to these bodies of law that are being put out there that say Indigenous. Because I don't know, over my course of my years, I've been Aboriginal, I've been Native, I've been Indigenous, I've been some names we probably won't say because these are other people labeling us, not ourselves identifying who we are. So asserting data sovereignty really is about this nation-to-nation relationship that we've all been envisioning, but nobody seems to know what to do with it because the feds don't know who we are as nations. Only we do. They think the nation is an entity. No, it's not. The entities are the people that have rights, the governments we create to hold our rights and make sense of them, to actually do something with them. And so it's important as we understand that data sovereignty really is empowering this relationship reset that has been, again, spoken of for the better part of a decade or more now. Click, please. What I'm doing is I'm encouraging every Indigenous government, every group, every nation group to do a search and replace on the text of the UN DRIP and put themselves in it, like my nation has done. It is now the Declaration on the Rights of the Ktunaxa peoples. You can make it the rights of the whoever people, Wiccan people, whoever. You make it each your own. As soon as you do that search and replace on that text, each one of those articles is something that you now have a right to, that your people have a responsibility to make into a law or some kind of policy in our contemporary environment now. So any rights we negotiated historically, many of us have done that. It's not like those things disappear. So the old treaties, the numbered treaties, land claims agreements, etc., standalone self-government agreements, all of these things that are very finite in what we've been able to negotiate, they don't disappear. They get brought into this context of DRIP. And you start looking at those negotiated rights inside of this broader basket of rights and figure out what you need to do with them, what you want of them. It's like updating your treaty with a broader negotiating space. And instead of just, them focused on the letter, you're focused more on the spirit here. And the letter can unfold over time through our community development processes, as they should rightly do. We have rights. We need to assert those rights. And we need to be able to then make these rights, turn these rights into responsibilities and privileges. Click, please. In preparation for identifying our people in provincial and federal environments, for taking ownership of our population identity and potential data sharing government to government, we've recently drafted a template for a tripartite data quality sharing framework agreement. And it's a framework agreement because it doesn't get into the nitty-gritty about the data. It's really about recognizing our sovereignty as nation group. It's recognizing the governments of our nation, and it's recognizing that we will maybe share data with the other governments. But at this point in time, it's basically them giving us that recognition that is so due. What it also does for us is it positions us to then have the authority recognized for us to delegate our authority as governing nations to any entity we care to delegate to that has the capacity to carry out certain rights on our behalf. So, for example, we can delegate to the BC First Nations Health Authority, which right now is just a not-for-profit. They're not in our rights and title space. They are not really an authority with any authority. They just deliver programs and services. What we can do through the DRIP era now is delegate authority as nation groups to that First Nations Health Authority to carry out that data collection function in a different way, in accordance with our data sovereignty, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunity for resetting relationships as this work unfolds. What this document does, as I say, it identifies the people who have the rights under DRIP, identifies our governments that hold the rights for the people, and identifies the language that we own. It identifies that we own all this intellectual property, and we will be ones who unpack DRIP basically in relation with the other governments in this tripartite space. So not nitty-gritty of data to be shared. And in fact, because we know that we have different values and our worldview is different and quality of life is different to us, we need to put the terms of quality on data and look at what quality data is to us. Because as I say, we don't want to just share the data they have already necessarily, because a lot of it is about disease and dysfunction. We can get that data, sure we can. But for us, really, we want to take the time to define what quality data is, then set the systems up both administratively, data capture systems through the process of the programs and service delivery, and then for surveys and surveillance systems as well. So being able to monitor how well our institutions are performing, as well as, of course, how well our people are doing. So we want to measure the presence of well-being, not looking again at that disease. Click, please. Each nation group should also perhaps think about drafting or actually just sort of amending and asserting, because we've already got a template that we'll share with you later on for this as well, drafting a declaration of data sovereignty. And as I say, it doesn't take a lot of money. It's just basically you take again a document and fill in the blanks and send it off to the other governments. And what it is in this declaration of data sovereignty is as I say, it's you setting yourself up. It's not about you promising anything to the other government or having the other government sign this. This is just your government signing this so that it legitimizes your authority and legitimizes anybody doing anything on your behalf. It's like the free, prior, and informed consent. We're the ones to give it. You taking ownership and control of the acronym OCAP and starting to want to make it your own. So we can share this declaration of data sovereignty, which is, as I say, just the assertion. And then we'll share the tripartite data quality framework agreement, which is now starting to get into data governance, where you're setting up policies, procedures, processes, et cetera. We will share those with you. The Ktunaxa, we don't have the professional capacity to actually assume full data governance and management functions. To date, we've managed to establish a records and information management system, an automated system, and we've got archives. But we're a long way from having fully functional data capacity at the nation level. And because we're such a small nation, it's likely that we'll never have the capacity to employ, data scientists, etc. Click, please. And that is why we, the Ktunaxa and BC First Nations, are supporting the work that the First Nations Information Governance Center is doing in this national strategy. So in BC, we envision that it's the Indigenous nations that will be taking over ownership over their intellectual property and data, delegating functionality to a board of directors, the nations themselves, direct function or direct delegation to this board to carry out work directly on behalf of the nation, so that they'll be directly accountable to that nation group. Boom, boom, direct accountability. We give you an authority to do some work on our behalf. Now you're going to account for what you've done with that work. So it'll be the first delegated model of authority to any institution in BC and probably across Canada that I know of in its full delegation model. So approximately 200 bands in BC, 200 governing bodies, giving this center, this institution, the authority to exist. Because as this national data strategy unfolds, what's intended, and I know this well because I was the one in 2016 who wrote the resolutions to go into the political forums, to go into the government, to get the money, to da-da-da-da-da. And 51 million has been let out in budget 2021 to start this work. And so over the next few years, and it's a data governance strategy, it'll lead to the establishment of the sovereign authorities having their authority recognized. It'll lead to having a data center in your province and territory to serve you. So the Northwest Territories, or perhaps even better yet, you might think about the nations across the north, how you working as nation groups instead of stopping at the Yukon border, for example, because I think that's kind of silly, because we're supposed to be working as nations in this. And so the budget identified resources. And so next year there will be money starting to flow. And Snooki Catholic sits at the board table with me. I'm the director for BC at the First Nations Information Governance Center table. Snooki's there for Northwest Territories. I encourage you to work along with the Snooki and that agency as this strategy starts to get ready to unfold, because it's got to be driven by the nations. It's to be, the end goal is that each nation achieves data sovereignty within their own worldview. And this data center that serves you should be doing it to your standards. So it's going to be important for you to figure out in the territories how you work on that. I've already in BC created the structure so that I can loop out to the nations and loop back in again. Go ahead and click. So I'm going to shift a little bit here from that piece to actually another strategy that's rolling out, and that's about community development. The community development strategy that's rolling out is based on the Indian, and I say Indian here because it still exists in those terms, the Indian Health Policy from 1979, founded on 3 pillars: that their government relate to us differently, that they manage programs differently, and that they adopt a community development approach to their work. And that resulted in Health Canada changing the way they did work, 5-year funding, a little flexible, planning is important, got to do a plan for the health money. But ISC or Indigenous services, they don't do that. They just basically, write a proposal for the money and slave, no money, sorry. And so we're trying to actually move this community development strategy out now through what's been drafted in the past few years, a joint strategy. And there's Indigenous advisors from across the country supporting this work to actually get the federal government to adopt their own principles. And those principles basically you see on the screen there. So in this work, we've got a number of projects happening, and we're looking for people from the Northwest Territories who work in the community environment, who've done some planning or know what should happen, to actually work with us. So off of this call here, circle back here through conversation to see if there's anyone up there that wants to help us to get this change management strategy underway. Click, please. So this strategy, as I say, is now rolling out as well. There's these projects that are happening, and we've got a training that's been drafted. The training that was drafted a number of years ago, and I think it needs to be updated. There's going to be a project underway this year to make that happen. So if you've got people in your region that know your culture really well, that maybe you've already got an advisory group that's set up there that does this, that does cross-cultural work, et cetera. Let us know about that so we can link you in on this training rewrite, because there's resources to pay some people to help do this work, to review the training and to make comments and recommendations for adjusting it. The training is a 1,000-foot training. I took the training 5 or 6 years ago. It needs to drop down to our level so they really know who we are. Click, please. And data really is about knowing who we are. It helps us to support people in their environments. We know how traumatized our people are. And in fact, at Ktunaxa, we did research in the early 1990s. We know that we have 40% fetal alcohol school-age population then. Those are our adults now. So almost half of our adults have had brain trauma because of fetal alcohol exposure. Now we overlay the trauma, intergenerational trauma from colonization on that, and we know what we're experiencing. So my nation, in order to address fetal alcohol exposure in the early 1990s, we used community development and population health philosophy. And so we moved towards a strength-based process for addressing child welfare, health, employment, education, et cetera. And we've got to look at this as a holistic way of dealing with our people. We know that. It's not, you touch it over here and over here and over here. We know we've got to do that. So it's population health and determinants of health we're talking about here. Determinants of health are really a person's personal characteristics and their behaviors and the circumstances they find themselves in, as well as their environments. We can change environments, cause the circumstances to change, behaviors change. Click, please. And so this is an example of how the Ktunaxa Nation have framed their program environment, their moving forward to achieve strong, healthy people again. That's part of our vision, strong, healthy citizens and communities. And so this strategic approach is really about building on our strengths. We believe we can inform our relationships with the other governments, we can reform, we can heal. Our elders have told us there is not enough Ktunaxa to throw even one away. We don't want welfare. We want to rebuild our internal economy and be self-sufficient once again. Click, please. It's recognized, of course, that this complex environment we're in with these complex behavioral and complex challenges we're experiencing, the addictions and all of the other things, we know that we need a complex case management framework to deal with it. And so what we've proposed, and you'll see it behind me as well as on the screen now, is from a poster that I drafted a number of years ago, helping to explain the determinants of health. And so we've proposed that as we move this national strategy out, and in fact, as we move the fiscal policy reform process forward, we consider funding nations to address the determinants of health, not just health services, but looking at the overall determinants of health. So the broader 12 determinants of health, in which culture should be viewed as the foundational determinant. Our language and our land stewardship, which is really who we are, our culture, we can look at those other determinants then and make sense of them. We can put quality back into the picture here. What is quality of life from our own perspective? Click, please. We also know through this process, we've got functions of governance that are not being funded right now. And that's what the fiscal policy reform was about, funding us to take care of our own people. There's devolution supposed to be happening, but we can't devolve until we build our own capacity. So this nation-to-nation relationship, the relationship between the Ktunaxa peoples and the federal government through our governments, should result in sustainable, sufficient, predictable funding, that's their words, for our nation group to carry out the functions of governance and operate our governments so that we can address those determinants of health over time. That's self-determination. That is self-government. Click, please. And so this is the last slide, I promise. Historically, Canada has related to us through program authorities managed by regional bureaucrats. Right now, there's almost 700 program authorities that get either voted on, because very few of them are statutory authorities because the feds have no statutory authority for half of what they fund for us because it's been devolved through the Constitution to another level of government. And so they have to get voted authority to spend on us every year. And there's so much bureaucracy behind that. So I've suggested to them, given that there's only 92 languages in Canada that we all attach to, use those as the program authorities, use those as the spending authorities, align all of your resources with our identities, and then put our governments right there, right below that. So you know what we're doing, you know what our money is being spent on. So Treasury Board doesn't have to go, looking for all of these authorities for spending, or the departments from Treasury Board anymore. Those spending authorities will be negotiated with our nation groups directly for everything in DRIP. And we will be the ones to define quality of life and to measure what matters. And these data centers that are being built are to help us to do that work. So we don't want to close the gap between ourselves and Canadians. That's measuring assimilation. We want to close the gap between who we are and who we want to be in the future. Thank you.
Oh my Lord. Well, I thank you there, Gwen Phillips, for all that information, and for your passion and for your story. Lots to go over there. I know you mentioned about not being a data geek, but a governance geek. And I can see how learning about data, you applied it to, I guess, the idea of governance based on your own peoples in your own ways. A great presentation. Also, really thought it important to point out as well too about being able to measure vibrancy, as you said it. Also, being able to measure the presence of wellness within our communities as a barometer, as to quantify those things. So powerful, and and being able to use the data to back up our stories as well too. Oh man, I was writing so many notes there. Gwen, thank you for your presentation. I know we saw some applauses there from some of the people as well too. Just for the audience and the participants, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity to share with our presenters at the end of our webinar. So again, thank you very much, Gwen. All right, up next, our next presenter is Dr. Kelly Skinner, the second presentation today. Dr. Skinner is an associate professor in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo and has a CIHR research chair in applied public health. So when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Skinner here. The webinar and the virtual floor is all yours there.
Thank you so much, Denise. Hello to everybody, and thanks so much to Gwen for such a wonderful start to this webinar and your presentation. So, I think that provides a lot of important information about where you've gone in your work in building this data center and around Indigenous data sovereignty, and opportunities for the Northwest Territories to think more about that. So, I'm coming at this presentation from a researcher perspective, and so I'm going to provide some background on the way I see some of the data ethical principles, the way data are collected right now for some specific data collection tools that are already happening. And I think that, combined with the way that Gwen has been able to provide some options and opportunities for what can sort of happen maybe moving forward about data within the Northwest Territories, I think that's a great way to think about this. So I'm coming at it, from this researcher perspective. So Julian, can you please share the slides?
Stand by, Kelly.
Sure, no problem. I can probably move to the second slide while we're waiting here. So I did want to acknowledge that I'm in Waterloo, Ontario. I grew up in Northwestern Ontario in Thunder Bay, and I currently live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Haldeman Tract, where my campus, office, and home are situated, great, next slide, please, is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. So in addition to acknowledging the land, it's important for me to recognize the historical and ongoing impacts of colonization and for me to commit to action and to respect the principles of the dish with one spoon wampum. And the term "a dish with one spoon" refers to a concept developed by the Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region here, where they had ceremonies to celebrate the making of a treaty. And at these ceremonies, the parties involved would exchange wampum belts to symbolize their agreement. Next slide, please. So just a little bit quickly about my research and evaluation background. So I've worked for more than 15 years in research and evaluation, primarily around food systems and food security with Northern and Indigenous communities. I started my work really in Northern Ontario, being from Thunder Bay. That was an area that I chose to work in. And then when I joined the University of Waterloo, rejoined the University of Waterloo in 2015, after doing a postdoctoral fellowship at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, I started working with Dr. Brian Laird here, and he's a toxicologist, and he already had ongoing research in the Northwest Territories. So I was brought into some of those projects with the lens of as a social scientist. So I'm not generally a quantitative researcher, and also because I had some background in nutrition. So related to the contaminants work that he was doing, there was also information collected around what people were eating. And a lot of my work is around that sort of food systems piece. Next slide, please. So in addition to sort of the food piece, I've also done some work in water and water security, as well as health and risk communication. So some of the things we have worked on in the Northwest Territories is having on the land camps, cross-cultural knowledge sharing on the land camps. You can see some pictures of those during my presentation, as well as thinking about terminology and how some of the words that we use as researchers don't translate into any same meaning within the languages of the people that we work with. Next slide, please. So I am going to cover sort of broadly some ethical principles. I will talk a little bit about OCAP. I know that Gwen already covered it, so I probably won't spend too much time. And then a little bit about the application of those ethical principles, and talk about data that are collected by the First Nations Information Governance Center. Gwen did mention Snooki Catholic, who's with Dene Nation, and Dene Nation is one of the organizations that works to collect a lot of those data in the Northwest Territories. So I'll talk a little bit about those data, as well as the First Nations Regional Health Survey and a few other survey reports, how those data are accessed from the First Nations Information Governance Center, and then just briefly touch on Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think Gwen did a great job of capturing that aspect. So during my presentation, I hope you can sort of see the connection between, you know, what the current sort of state is of a lot of the data that exist in the Northwest Territories, how it's collected, how it's managed, and then think about that sort of idea around how there could be more capacity built around a data center, some sort of opportunities around data in the Northwest Territories. Next slide. So I'll start with the ethical principles briefly. OCAP, I'll talk about TCPS as well as USAY. Next slide, please. So as Gwen mentioned, OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, and is a registered trademark. I'm also going to talk about a few other sort of ethical principles of engagement or ethical principles. So the Tri-Council policy statement for research involving First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people within Canada, which is something that as researchers in an institution, we are, abide by with all of our ethical processes. And I also wanted to just mention this USAY research framework from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres as an example of something that maybe is a little broader and a little more relational than something like OCAP. Next slide, please. So OCAP does stand for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, and it is managed by the First Nations Information Governance Center. Next slide, please. And as Gwen mentioned, the OCAP principles really apply to, research, data, or information activities involving First Nations people, but it is managed by this organization. The idea is that OCAP would offer a way for First Nations to make decisions regarding the research that's going to be done, what purpose that information or data will be used, and also where the information will be physically stored and who will have access to it. Next slide. So ownership really refers to the relationship of a First Nations community to its cultural knowledge, data, and information, and control is the control of that data and the information and how it is, who has control over it. Next slide, please. Gwen did a very good job of describing this, so I'm just going to go over it quickly. And then access is who has access to that information or data about themselves as well as their communities, regardless of where that data are being held. And possession is a mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. Next slide, please. So there is a course, an OCAP course that's managed by the First Nations Information Governance Center. And there is a cost to it. And the course is a series of 7 modules, and each of the modules takes about 40 minutes. And anyone who is working with data from the First Nations Information Governance Center needs to take the OCAP course before they're able to work with those data. And there's other sort of groups who have sort of made it compulsory or mandatory for people to take the OCAP course before they work with any of those data. At our university institutions, it's not a requirement, but we have other agreements in place, I think, regarding data with the communities, directly with the communities that we work with, and I think that sort of is an important aspect of this, even without having OCAP as a specific training for us. Next slide, please. So in addition to OCAP, as a researcher, we have to apply for ethics approval within our institutions, and we have to follow the Tri-Council policy statement. And within that Tri-Council policy statement, there is a specific chapter on research involving First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people within Canada. And this chapter involves 20 principles or protocols, and I've listed them here, but I'm not going to read them all off. Next slide, please. I'm mostly going to focus on sort of a little bit about research agreements, privacy and confidentiality, as well as sort of the intellectual property related to research. Next slide, please. And the other sort of research principle background that I wanted to just mention, because maybe some of you haven't heard of this one. When I was speaking with Julian yesterday, he hadn't. It is fairly Ontario based, and so that might be one of the reasons why. And I when we first encountered this framework, we felt that it was a nice sort of addition to OCAP, and it had that relational piece, and it stressed the validity of Indigenous knowledge. Gwen talked a lot about that, as well as the direct benefits to communities. So you can see here that it has 4 main areas, and USAE stands for utility, self-voicing, access, and interrelationality. And I think this interrelationality piece is really what's important here, and I think it's kind of what's missing that I found when we're just sort of trying to adhere to OCAP principles, or even sometimes the TCPS statements, where we're not getting that relational piece. Next slide, please. And there's also, other ethical principles that have been built, and these ones specifically were developed for higher education and institutional settings. But if we think about them with respect to research, and try and sort of think about the 4 R's of respect, reciprocity, relevance, and responsibility when we're talking about collecting data, working with communities, analyzing those data, how those data are stored and housed, and all of those aspects around research principles. Next slide, please. And I think it's important to think about research as relationship. Gwen also talked about this. And I think this needs to be the basis for all research, that there is this relationship built, and trusting relationships are really critical to that. And really, you know, for communities to have the ability to collect the data that they want. Gwen talked about this too. So a lot of our research projects, we try and build around the needs and the interests of the communities that we work with. They may not have the capacity to do some of this research. A lot of the toxicology research that my colleague does, a lot of the analysis of those samples that are collected, they need to be done in specific facilities to be analyzed and whatnot. And so it's an opportunity to have this relationship where there might not be capacity to either collect the data or to analyze those data, that we can support the needs and desires and interests of the communities that we work with in terms of where they want research to go and what kind of topics they want research to be on for their own communities. One of the ways that we try and build OCAP principles into our projects is to co-develop community research agreements. And these outline the roles and responsibilities of both the academic researchers and the community partners. And the partners really tell us what they want to be in there. It may include processes respecting specific customs, values, and priorities within the community. And it also includes the aspects of OCAP of the data specifically for the projects that we work on. Next slide, please. And I did want to just share that Dr. Julie Bull has some really great talks that are available on YouTube, talking about research being relational, research being reflexive, and a lot about Indigenous research ethics. And she's an Inuk scholar and a poet, and her talks are very engaging. So if you want to sort of explore that a little bit more, I would recommend you look her up. Next slide, please. So really, you know, following up on what Gwen was talking about, if we think about the exercise of self-determination, is the right of peoples to construct knowledge the way that they want to, and to have their own self-determined definitions of what is real and what is valuable. So when we think about data and how it's collected, how it's stored, how it might be housed, used, and shared over the longer term, we need to come back to this notion of what really is knowledge for this group. And what knowledge might be valuable to them, instead of just thinking, you know, about that deficit approach that Gwen talked about. So thinking about, you know, the values of that particular community, and resilience and sort of that other side of a more positive approach than always being an a deficit-based approach. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share a few projects that we have in the Northwest Territories around climate change and food security. Next slide, please. The main one is this CIHR team grant that's over the longer term. It was originally, I think, 4 years, but with the pandemic, we've had a lot of extensions. So it's still going to be ongoing for a number of years from now. And really, this project was built. We had a meeting a year before to sort of design the project with community partners. And John Bizot, who is here, he is also involved with this project. And along with the community partners, they decided sort of which communities they thought we should work in, as well as sort of the focus areas for some of the themes. For example, you can see on the bottom here, they really wanted us to focus on traditional knowledge, governance, youth, and gender. And so within the Northwest Territories, we are working with 4 regions and 6 communities within those 4 regions. Around all aspects of the food system. So that includes country or traditional food, market food, as well as agriculture. And thinking about how there might be climate adaptations that communities are experiencing, and having to climate adaptations that communities are participating in. And one of the main sort of pieces of this work is to provide some evidence and evaluation of community-led initiatives, so initiatives around food and food security. But trying to do that from a lens of not as much of a Western research lens. So thinking about how those community-led initiatives can be evaluated using the value system of the communities themselves. And then sort of part of my job is to be a bridger and to bring that evidence into some of the more national governance and national governments, and to sort of use that information to push policymakers to support these community-led initiatives. Next slide, please. So we're specifically working a lot in the Inuvialuit settlement territory, region, and that's one of the 4 regions that we're working in. And so as a part of this larger C4FS, or Climate Change and Food Security Action Project, we had funds to hire project coordinators in each of the regions. So we have a project coordinator hired in the Inuvialuit settlement region. She's in Palutuk. As a part of that, so she is actually not an employee of the university. We have a 4-year financial and transfer agreement with the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, and they are responsible for hiring her, and they are involved in the research. And I think it's important to mention this part too, because a part of that agreement is also where the data are housed. And so we know that as researchers, especially researchers in the South, the data should not be housed with us over any long-term period. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a place where the data could be housed. A lot of the communities we work with in the ISR don't necessarily have the capacity within their own community corporations to house those data. And so the data will actually be housed at the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation and not housed with the researchers at the end of the project. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to sort of shift that control, access, and possession of the data and the ownership of the data to another organization and away from the researchers. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So I did want to talk a little bit about the data that the First Nations Information Governance Center collects. Next slide, please. If you are not familiar, the First Nations Information Governance Center is a nonprofit First Nations organization which operates on a mandate from the Assembly of First Nations, and it's governed by a board of directors from 10 provinces and the 2 territories. Initially, I think Nunavut was involved, but they broke off after I think the early data collections that the First Nations Information Governance Center was doing in 1997. So they do have a mandate to oversee data collection on First Nations and in Northern communities, as well as knowledge dissemination and OCAP around those data. A big part of their work is the implementation of these surveys, and they do it in collaboration with regional member organizations, following established protocols, policies, and procedures. Next slide, please. And so they do have guiding principles. So in addition to OCAP, the FNIGC actually only released this in 2020. I was actually looking for it because I thought they had been using this from the beginning, but this is sort of some guiding principles that they have been working on over a long period of time. So they do have work where they are trying to move towards more data sovereignty, but they started from a place of really just trying to incorporate a cultural framework, thinking about the data being driven by community, the type of data that were collected, and that these regional centers or organizations that they were affiliated with were actually the sort of users of that data. Next slide, please. So the First Nations Information Governance Center does administer surveys, and they do that in coordination with regional partners. And so this is just sort of a list of some of the surveys that they administer. They do administer the First Nations Regional Health Survey, and there have been multiple phases of that survey since, I guess, 1997. They also have several other surveys. They have a survey focused on early childhood education and employment. They have the First Nations Labor, Employment and Development Survey, an oral health survey, as well as a community survey. And I'm just going to highlight that I'm going to talk a little bit about the First Nations Regional Health Survey, as well as the First Nations Labor, Employment and Development Survey, because those are the two that I've been involved with over the past several years, I think since 2013. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the First Nations Information Governance Center, as a part of their regional health survey, they do have regional partners. And so there were these multiple phases. So the most recent phase of data that were collected was phase 3, and they're just, I think they were trying to start collecting phase 4 during the pandemic, but I think they may have maybe had to stop. So you can see here there's the organizations that are the regional partners as a part of these data. And in the Northwest Territories, the partner is Dene Nation. Next slide, please. So Dene Nation really is the organization that looks after the collection of the data, as well as survey development. So getting feedback on the survey questions themselves, thinking about which questions might be appropriate, and which, trying to get some feedback from communities that are involved in the data collection as to how those questions should be asked. And so there's sort of a core set of questions that kind of get asked for the entire First Nations Regional Health Survey. So the idea is that the health survey is implemented across Canada, so in the 10 provinces and 2 territories. But then there are some specific questions that might be regional for each of the survey data collections. Next slide, please. So they do gather feedback and incorporate that from these regional advisory committees, as well as regional coordinators, data analysts, and stakeholders. How the surveys are administered by the First Nations Information Governance Center is they work with these regional partners. So in the Northwest Territories, it would be Dene Nation. So Dene Nation would have hire community members and train those community members, and then they would work as knowledge gatherers to administer the survey in their own communities and surrounding areas. And for these surveys, participants do respond on their own, so they answer the questions using an iPad. There has been data collected for across different age categories. So there is adults who participate, as well as youth and children. And the youth, depending on how old they are, they might have a parent with them or not. And the children always have sort of a parent proxy answering the questions for them. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of sort of recruitment for these knowledge gatherers or these data gatherers for the last phase of the First Nations Regional Health Survey, to have First Nations people collecting those data within their own communities. Next slide, please. And so, you know, the goal of the First Nations Information Governance Center is to really have community participation in all aspects of the design, collection, and analysis to ensure that the data is relevant and the governance and accountability mechanisms are appropriate. Next slide, please. And they do have a cultural framework that they've been, that was designed at the I think before phase 1 of the First Nations Regional Health Survey. And you can see here the various topic areas of data that are collected. And at the center is the idea of health and wellness or well-being. And then you can see the various categories. So there's a lot of questions. Actually, I'm surprised that so many people participate in the survey, because it is a very long survey. There's a lot of questions. It asks demographic information, but also information about healthcare access, housing, relationships, one of the things that I think was tried to be highlighted more in this phase 3 of the First Nations Regional Health Survey was looking at that more asset-based approach, cultural practices in communities, and trying to really think about how sort of a well-being approach instead of sort of that deficit-based approach. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of ways that these survey results are analyzed and shared. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what I know about that. I've been involved in sort of 2 ways that these data are used. Next slide, please. So the first way is these sort of national level reports for each phase of the data. And so the national level reports have been organized according to those topic areas that I mentioned in the cultural framework and showed there. And so for the phase 2 data, I was invited by my colleague Alyssa Levi to co-author the chapter with her on nutrition and food security. And there were other co-authors of many other chapters based on people's expertise. And then again, we also co-authored the phase 3 chapter on nutrition and food security. And phase 3 was a very, very long national data report. They had to put it into 2 volumes because there was so much information there. But again, they had different specific people with expertise authoring those chapters. So in some cases, it was not necessarily Indigenous person who was authoring those chapters. In some cases, it was a co-authorship, the way it was with Alyssa Levi and myself. So the data are pooled for these national reports. The data are pooled across all of the data that have been collected for all of the First Nations that participate in the survey. And so as an author of that chapter, we also did not even have access to the data itself. So the First Nations Information Governance Center has data analysts, and we would get data dictionaries, and we would know what questions were asked, and we would sort of decide, Alyssa and I would decide together, okay, what kind of information do we want analyzed and we want to share in the specific chapter around nutrition and food security. So we would know the questions, and we would tell the data analysts at the First Nations Information Governance Center how we wanted those data analyzed. So we never touched the raw data. The data were always housed within the First Nations Information Governance Center. And then they would give us just aggregate results, and we would sort of do a back and forth and let them know if we wanted more analysis. We did try and focus on more of an asset-based approach, but it is kind of difficult sometimes when we weren't involved in the design of the questions. And so, there are still some questions that are sort of on the negative side. So, food security status, for example, but also things around food gathering and sharing of food and other aspects of food, where I think we had an opportunity to really sort of highlight a little bit more about some of the positive things that were happening within communities to keep people more food secure. Okay, next slide, please. So the other way that those data are analyzed are within those regional organizations that I mentioned. So within the Northwest Territories, it's Dene Nation that is the regional organization. And so Dene Nation does have access to those raw data. And they're the ones that collect it. Kind of the process happens is that it gets collected by those knowledge gatherers that are hired by Dene Nation, and then the data actually go to the First Nations Information Governance Center to get cleaned and weighted, and they do some other things with the data around analysis. And then Dene Nation has the option to create a report the way that they want to. And so each of those organizations can create a report from those data. And so after I'd worked on phase 2 and phase 3 in sort of a different capacity, where there were data analysts at the First Nations Information Governance Center who were doing the analysis, then the Dene Nation was looking for someone as more of a consultant to be able to do the analysis of these data, as well as to write it up and turn it into a report for them, with a lot of back and forth and you know, Dene Nation deciding how they wanted this report to look. For example, we structured it as 4 chapters around the 4 areas of well-being, so physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental well-being. Tried to incorporate a lot of pictures from the communities that were a part of the data collection, from pictures from Dene Nation archives, etc. And so that was an opportunity where you know, my team did work with the raw data, but we also, you know, signed agreements about the confidentiality of those data. And then once we're done with the report, then we sort of destroy the data on our end, and we don't get to house any of that data any further. And Dene Nation can decide how they want that report to look. Next slide, please. And so more recently, we've also worked on the First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey report for Dene Nation, and that report is forthcoming. So we're just about finished now. And so I think there was a lot of learning too from the First Nations Regional Health Survey report from the Northwest Territories that we worked on last time. So we were trying to incorporate this time even more pictures, and make it a lot more visually appealing for anyone who is going to read the report. And these reports typically have been brought to chiefs meetings, for example, and that's one of the places that they've been shared. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to access FNIGC data. I mean, as a researcher and you know, I've had a different kind of, been in a different space, sort of in writing these chapters, as well as the Dene Nation Northwest Territories data reports. Next slide, please. But there are ways that you know, general public can access some of the aggregate data. So you can, on the website, sort of look at the available data on particular topics. You could make a data request, and there's also information about data resources. So they've tried to be transparent in, you know, how those data were collected, what the questions were, and all those sort of aspects of it. And they have a lot of resources and documents on their website around this governance piece. And as I mentioned, they have some of these new documents around the principles that they're trying to sort of move towards in terms of data sovereignty. Next slide, please. So if you wanted to just sort of take a look quickly at a particular topic from a survey, you could choose the survey there on the bottom. There's a drop-down menu, and you can choose which survey you want data from. You could choose whether you want adult data, youth data, or child data if you're looking at the regional health survey. And then you can filter it by category and decide what topic area you might want to see a graph from. Next slide, please. So after you do that, so I chose adult, the adult regional health survey and nutrition and food security. And it gave me a series of graphs, and I just pulled up one here so you can see. This was a graph that is presented from the question about adults who participated in harvesting and gardening activities in the past 3 months prior to the survey, and the data are divided by sex. So it's kind of crude. You know, you can choose the topic area and which survey, but you can't really ask for anything else using this method. So this way of accessing those data is kind of whatever graphs have already been pre-populated, you can sort of access them that way, but you can't manipulate them. You couldn't say, oh, I want female and male combined here, or something like that. Next slide, please. However, if you did want to actually work with the data, you could make a data request through the FNIGC platform. And you can get the analysts at FNIGC to do the data analysis and give you the results, but it does cost money. And so there is a barrier definitely there. The other option is they have a data center in Ottawa where the data are housed by the FNIGC, and you can go there and also access the data if you wanted to as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to sort of come back to this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty. You know, Gwen did such a great job of talking about what that could look like. And, you know, what I've tried to do here is to provide some background on what the data access looks like right now and how it's housed and who maybe has control over it, the way that I understand it from my perspective as a researcher. But really, you know, this idea of moving towards more data sovereignty. So beyond just, you know, having communities provide input on what questions they want asked or how they want the data to be collected or where they want it to be housed, to really be the stewards of that data. Next slide, please. So thinking about, you know, as Gwen talked a lot about, being the rights holders and using those data for decision making and evidence-based decision making, and thinking about where those data gaps are, you know, thinking about transferring all of those government services. You know, Gwen talked about this too, having all of those bureaucrats in their positions, but how can we bring that back to the community and try and build the capacity of the community to have a data center or some way of self-determining and governing their own data situation. And Gwen talked a lot about UNDRIP here during her talk, but just sort of to return to that and think about, you know, really the goal ultimately is to have this First Nations as stewards of their own data, and it not be housed by others, and that communities can do that themselves and build the capacity for that. Okay, my last slide is just a picture. So that was my sort of cue to go to questions.
Thank you for your presentation there, Dr. Skinner. And it's gonna be a little bit of a virtual applause in our webinar for sharing all that information. We're going to try to make some time to go for questions. Again, please drop your comments or questions within the chat box. But yeah, a lot of applause emojis there for Dr. Skinner from our webinar. But before we get to questions and hopefully back to our presenters, we're going to make a little bit time for Dr. Stephanie Erbacher-Fox, the scientific director for Hotiits'eeda. Good day there, Stephanie. Do you want to share some thoughts? The floor is all yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Dennis. Thank you, Dr. Kelly Skinner. Thank you, Gwen Phillips, for your presentations, which were very enlightening and meaningful, and I think really draws a line under the fact that for Indigenous people in Canada for a long time, data was often seen as fairly inaccessible. We still have that situation in the Northwest Territories where we do have some really good public data, but meaningful data, particularly in regards to health, for example, is very difficult, if not completely inaccessible, for lots of very good reasons. But at the end of the day, it means that Indigenous governments in particular can't get access to data that they need to be able to understand what's going on in their communities and to be able to make good governance decisions. So really appreciated both of the presentations. I think particularly Ms. Phillips, the presentation really, in your presentation, I think yours highlighted the fact that in the face of not having access to data or not getting cooperation from government agencies that access data, Indigenous governments often just have to do it themselves. And I think all of us who work with Indigenous governments have seen examples of them just doing their own surveys with the people who they have in their governments to just go out and get information. And very good information, very rich information, because where data often falls down is that while it measures things, it doesn't often or always lead to really solid understanding. So I think in both presentations, it was really great to see how far we've come with different Indigenous governments being able to and having the capacity and the funding to be able to think about and actually put into place approaches to gathering information about their membership for the purposes of making decisions and providing better programs and services to their memberships and their populations. So just wanted to say thank you. I wasn't here earlier, but it's been a real honor and a real pleasure to have hosted you both today online. And thank you also to Denise for being our host through this. Thanks.
Thanks there, Stephanie. Thanks for sharing those words. Yeah, I wanted to echo all those things that you shared as well too. And we are personally living in an information age, and that information and data is being sold on a number of different platforms. So it's really important for not only for our own nations, but also for ourselves and how we use and protect our own personal data when we're out there. I have a question here for both Gwen and for Dr. Skinner. In terms of principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, do you have a model preference such as OCAP or perhaps something else? Is there like do you have like a preference for a model when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty? Maybe we can go to Gwen and then we'll go to Kelly right after.
Yeah, I have a preference, and it's called let the nation figure it out for themselves, because all of the principles that come to us are research principles. They're for people that are standing there staring at us. And it's the space of ethics. It's like how to get close enough without getting in your personal space, but we want to be in our own personal space. So it's actually flipping the whole darn thing. So that's why OCAP is ownership and control is governance, setting standards. So each nation group has to do that. The Gwich'in people, I'm not going to say it right, the different peoples of every region. I can go through the 34 nations in BC, the Statliam, the Hotii, the Ktunaxa, the Ktunaxa, etc. But every one of us has got to go through that, because that's self-determination. And that's really taking OCAP from an organization's principles for research to a place where it's actually about sovereignty and self-determination. So thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Yeah, that empowering nations to try to figure out on their own what they want to look at and how they look at. I think that's a good model. Same question to you there, Dr. Skinner.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar in terms of, you know, whatever community we're working with, we want them to tell us what they want in terms of the data that are collected, how they're collected, and how they're housed. And so that governance piece is informed by what they want, and we try and do as much as we can to fit within that. We do have some confines by the structural sort of systems within our institutions as university institutions, for example. And I think there's a lot more pushback, even by researchers that work with Northern communities and Indigenous communities, about some of those processes that are very colonial and Western thinking within our institutions, and say, well, this isn't the way that the community wants it. So how can we change this process within our institution to honor what the community is asking us to do? So I think we're trying to do that more, or myself and my colleagues are trying to do that more. So really listen to the communities we work with and try and follow the governance structure that they want in terms of their data.
Thanks for that there, Gwen and Kelly. We're nearing the end of the time here for our webinar here together. I just wanted to go back to Gwen and Kelly, maybe just a final thought to share with the group when it comes to this topic. We'll go to you, Kelly, first, and then after that, we'll go to Gwen. Just anything you'd like to share, some final thoughts for the people of the webinar.
Yeah, so, I think there has been interest by organizations. I mean, Gwen mentioned Snooki Catholic, who's at Dene Nation, who has been sort of managing this First Nations regional health survey data collection for a long time now. So thinking about what organizations might be able to build that capacity around a data center. And I think you've got some great example here of the work that Gwen has been doing in how to start working towards that. And I think that, that's sometimes, thinking about how someone else who has done that and the sort of the processes might help with a starting point anyways, and thinking about how that could happen for the Northwest Territories.
Great. Thanks for that there, Dr. Skinner. Gwen, just some final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, so again, I think the very first one is to really take a serious consideration of putting yourself into the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Like, do a search and replace, put yourself in there, and then think about this work from that perspective. When I think about this national data strategy, and so it was funny for me, Kelly, to listen to you talk about FNIG, because I've been a director on that board for 8 years. So it's like I was should I correct her on these things? No, you don't do that. Of course, because the principles are actually from the national strategy principles. So those are embedded in there. I've shared the executive summary with you, with the team. I think Julian's got it. So he's going to share a few documents out. But I think that the data center is happening. It's going to happen in your region. And so the important thing is to make sure that your nations are delegating to that center what it is you want them to do and to not do. And at the same time, having them begin to build capacity within your community governments for them to understand how to actually take these concepts of science and bring them into your environment. Because I'll tell you what, I mentioned my great-grandfather was a war chief. He was a data collector en masse. He had surveillance officers out there big time to know when the Blackfoot were coming, et cetera, et cetera. We were buffalo hunters. We had to bet. We were planners extraordinaire. And so we cannot forget that. Every one of our nations has this inherent data collection systems and values and probably even laws. Certain families own songs, certain people hunt in a certain place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had a duck chief, a camp chief, a war chief. We had women's societies, men's societies. They were all data collectors. And we all were informants to ensure that the collective well-being was maintained. So it was not about the capitalistic concept of data. I own it, my intellectual property. I'm smarter than you. I get tenure, you don't. It's about how do we make sure that we collectively share this knowledge so that we continue to be the strongest we can be. Because complex problems are not solved through competition. They're solved through collaboration. And that's what we're experts in as Indigenous people. So thank you very much for inviting me here to this table, and I look forward to future conversations because the strategy is rolling out in your region. You will get money to build your data center. So making sure your nations are driving that process is vitally important. So thank you again.
Again, Gwen Phillips, Kelly Skinner, thanks for taking time to come share with your work. And that's right. I encourage people to make those data connections out there and empower and build capacity when it comes to that in your communities and your individuals who might be interested as well too. So with that, if we could just real quickly give a little applause for our presenters for coming on here and sharing with us. And when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty. So Masi Cho, thank you very much. On behalf of Hotiits'eeda, I would like to thank everybody for coming here to this webinar. And if you're watching a recorded version of this, you're so lucky, so much information here. All right, so that's it. My name is Dennis Nakeko. Take care of each other and yeah, build that capacity when it comes to data sovereignty. Masi Cho.